So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am here in conversation with the best-selling author and my dear mentor friend, Jacqueline Novogratz, who is CEO of Acumen and has just released the most fantastic new book called Manifesto for a Moral Revolution. So, Jacqueline, you and I met what now feels like an eon ago when the world was first going into lockdown, and I was just making this, for me, what felt a kind of just huge move from the world of business and a real focus on profit to the world of philanthropy. And I was slightly panicked. And you really helped me understand that the two worlds weren't binary opposites. And actually, if we get it right, it's because we start thinking about not profit or purpose, not private or public, not stakeholders or shareholders, but replacing that or with a big ampersand. And clearly, with the Black Lives Matter movement, with COVID-19, with everything that's happening in the world right now, your proposition has been proved to be absolutely true. And I just wondered if you could share with everyone some of your life experiences, your career learnings that helped you come to that realization, and how it really helped you think about the mission for Acumen.
Thanks, Susanna, and thanks to you and to Nicole and to Sonia and the Laidlaw Foundation for having me, and everyone for showing up. It's really wonderful to be part of this conversation and to see how much you've done since that first meeting. In a way, Susanna, I think at the heart of moral leadership, I've discovered that one of the most important skills we can develop is holding opposite truths in tension. And it is a result, as you said, of, in many ways, my past experiences that started off in very traditional finance in the early 1980s, working in Latin America during a financial crisis. And I saw the power of markets to bring about efficiencies, innovation, prosperity. I also found that I personally really enjoyed the tools of using markets, and yet I saw their limitations when it came to low-income people. The poor weren't even welcome into the bank. And so suddenly I started to understand at a deeper level that the perils of markets are their ability to exclude and in some cases to exploit. And certainly to create deep inequality, which is what we're seeing around the world. Then I moved to Rwanda in Central Africa, and I helped start the first microfinance bank there. And saw, again, the power for low-income people of having choice that comes with access to markets. And yet, this was a time of enormous top-down international development aid and assistance, and saw how that too often leads to dependence. So that even though we needed philanthropy, it had to be used in such a way that also enabled individual freedom. And so Acumen came about with this idea that maybe we could take the best of markets without being seeing it as a religion, recognizing that it was a great listening device, but it also had real limitations, and then bring to it the philanthropic piece. And then as we grow, partnering with government as well. And so I would say that was the beginning of my really seeing the world in and toward terms rather than either or. And today it's gotten even more nuanced because we very much have learned how to use what we call patient capital, or philanthropic based and backed money that we then put into for-profit companies with 10 to 15-year investments of equity or loans. And that while that enabled us to build over 100 companies that have now brought services to 300 million low-income people, the capital itself wasn't enough. Additionally, we had to really focus on talent, and a specific kind of talent that was building the kind of character that could navigate all of these tensions, that could start by listening to the poor. And then we realized that that also wasn't enough, because if you didn't hold yourself accountable to the social impact you were creating, rather than just the financial, what was it for, in terms of building a new sector? And so we built a system of impact metrics that started by listening to the poor, where we text 5,000-10,000 customers of any one of our companies at the same time, understand their, not only their perspective, but actual quantifiable changes in their lives. And that's made all the difference. And so Acumen today is much more of a conglomerate, where we've got 150 million in the nonprofit side. We have 3 for-profit funds. We have a university online, and we have just spun off this metrics platform.
Wow.
Very nuanced.
And in the midst of doing all of that, you thought, I know, I'll also write a book. Well, how did you find the time? What made you choose to do it? Obviously not quite now, pre-now, and then publish it at absolutely the perfect time.
Well, one of the things that we look for in entrepreneurs, and people say, well, what kind of character are you actually looking for? And one is to find those entrepreneurs that actually not only recognize their strengths and, importantly, their weaknesses, but surround themselves with a team that increasingly is better than they are. And that is the Acumen team, where my management team, each of them is much smarter at what they do than I will ever be. And so we've got the strength to allow me to use my best and highest goods, my best and highest skills, because they are using their best and highest skills. And that takes a while to learn as a founder. So I would say that would be where I was able to take time. The second piece is, it was really about 5 years ago when my board decided I should write a book. And I, quite frankly, went away. I had been given a 1-month fellowship that was just given to me. So the forces of the universe came together. I didn't really want to write a book. And so I did it dutifully as a CEO. And I thought about my role and Acumen's role as a pioneer of impact investing and patient capital investment. And it was very technical. And I looked at what it actually would take to build the right kind of capital, et cetera. And not only was it pretty boring, but it was, more importantly, missing the point. Because when I really was honest with myself and stepped back and thought about what the difference is between those entrepreneurs who can build a company and those entrepreneurs who go on to change an entire system, it comes down to character. It comes down to a particular set of principles and, more important, practices that really, I believe, are essential to solving the most critical problems of our time. And we have enough proof points now, given that we've done so much for so long, that I felt very increasingly confident that that was the right book to write, particularly as we were going through this rapid transition, and understanding that our traditional systems of capitalism, democracy, seemed to be running their course. We did not know with what to replace them. And so it wasn't like we could hand a roadmap to the next generation. We could only build a moral compass that could help each of us move toward more inclusive and more sustainable systems that put our shared humanity at the center rather than profit.
And do you think, you talk about the need to solve these complex problems, and that you can only solve complex problems if you come at it with this different approach, with humanity at the center. and otherwise these problems have just become intractable. Is that the main reason for that just sort of brick wall that seems to be happening around these complex problems?
Well, I was actually just speaking with a mentor of mine, because he was saying the hard part about the movement that you're talking about is that the narrative is more complex. And there's truth to that, because the narrative that you and I were taught and that we grew up with was Milton Friedman's narrative. And it was really aided by Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, which was we had one responsibility: maximize shareholder value. When I went to business school in 1990, the year of the Berlin Wall falling, when capitalism had won and communism had lost, I was taught in my ethics class that it was not just our fiduciary responsibility, but our ethical responsibility to maximize shareholder value. That's a really easy narrative. And it was about freedom and efficiency and human rights. And there was indeed a flourishing of the individual and of freedom. And technically 1 billion people were lifted out of poverty in the last 30 years. The problem is that, and so often the solutions we find end up being the problems we later have to solve. The problem was that simultaneously we saw this acceleration of technology that was also connecting us around the world. And we did get the best and the worst of technology and markets in that, yes, freedom, yes, the individual, to a point where we became so free and so individualistic that we forgot the health of our planet. We forgot the health of our most vulnerable. And even more important, the value that they bring. And so I think the wall we hit is that everything started accelerating so quickly. And we weren't just looking at our own community of people like ourselves now. We were looking at tribal communities, very traditional communities that now suddenly were also connected to this other world. And you started to see a real tension that was, I think, human rights and community, traditional religious and cultural practices versus an assumption of modernity, and helped by gross inequality, environmental fragility, all happening at the same time.
And I mean, if you look around the world right now with all of those injustices, inequalities, and so on, it could feel like a pretty bad place, right? We could sort of
a little overwhelming.
We could wallow in the this is not good, and I certainly know with some things like gender equality, which as a foundation we put a lot of effort into, a lot of work, and we sometimes think, how is it that organizations just won't do the most seemingly blindingly obvious things? Like, why on earth wouldn't you pay two people doing the same job the same amount of money? How can it make any sense whatsoever to say because somebody is one gender, they get paid more than somebody who's another gender? And how can it be anybody's business who somebody chooses to sleep with? So some of this stuff seems so ridiculous. And yet, reading in your book, you were talking about in 1986 still, it was illegal for a woman in Rwanda to open a bank account with her husband's permission. And now, today, Rwanda has the highest percentage of women parliamentarians of any country on earth. And I thought, wow, that is phenomenal. So change absolutely can happen if people have enough moral imagination to make it so. So could you talk to us a little bit more about that concept of moral imagination and maybe how you teach others what to do with that phrase?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to remember is that we create the systems. We are the systems. We can change the systems. And Acumen, we talk a lot about the fact that systems are designed exactly for the way that they're used. And we all buy into that. And so it really comes to finding those individuals who are willing to disrupt those systems. And that's not easy. That is going against the status quo. But I have seen extraordinary change in my life. 300 million people being served basic goods and services in ways that they can afford and value. It's been incredible. But it does take what we call moral imagination. So often we use the lens only of our own imagination when we are designing solutions or we are designing systems for people whose lives are completely unlike our own. And then we wonder why our solutions or our systems don't work. Moral imagination starts by putting ourselves in another person's shoes, recognizing that that's impossible to fully do, but we can certainly get close. That requires that we see them neither above or below us. And importantly, we neither victimize people nor do we idealize people. And then the second step of moral imagination is to immerse, to get close to individuals, understand their problem, importantly, analyze the structures that get in their way, and be honest about where they might be holding themselves back. At Acumen, moral imagination is a verb, because if you stop there, you may get a lot of intellectual points, but empathy without action reinforces the status quo. It's too close to sympathy. And so for us, it then requires acting, even if that means you fail 100 times. Probably the best example for us would be going back now 13 years, which is hard for me to believe. But two young guys, Ned Tozem and Sam Goldman, come into our offices with a $30 solar light and this dream that they will eradicate kerosene, which is dirty, expensive, pretty awful energy source, but the source that 1.5 billion people around the world depended on for their light. This is pre-electricity, and 1.5 billion people had no electricity. And so Sam and Ned had the moral imagination to see what they wanted to be able to do, but they also recognized that what they were up against was enormous. They didn't look at it intellectually. They lived with people. They moved to the places they wanted to serve. They understood from the perspective of the low-income people themselves what it meant when there was no trust, there were no roads, they had no income, there was no financing. And they tried anyway, knowing that they would make mistakes. But they listened at every juncture, recalibrating, solving problems, and ultimately had to build a company that provided the financing, provided the infrastructure, fought the status quo, the diesel and kerosene mafias. And just a few months ago, they announced that they had brought clean, affordable solar light and electricity to over 100 million of the world's poorest people. That's the moral imagination in action.
Yeah, I mean, that is clearly just phenomenal, isn't it? But it took patience, didn't it? This was not something that could be done overnight. So people needed to be determined and committed and not just raise their voices to say, this is a problem, but to commit themselves heart and soul to solving it.
Well, and it's where we can start to reimagine capitalism. You know, the early players here were Acumen with our patient capital. Now we've gotten some of our capital back, but we invested between two different funds, $11 million over a 13-year period. Wow. We put in 12 different fellows to enable them with talent. We connected them so that they could get grant support, so that they could actually build a market where there was no market in place. And we expect them to then help support the other companies, because now there's an energy revolution. Because we actually have a thesis now that if Africa really wants to solve its electricity problems in ways that are anti-fragile and help avert long-term climate crisis, we cannot do the status quo of continuing to extend the grid. We should be putting solar rooftop on every home. And so it's about imagination, it's about grittiness, resilience, and it's about a real sense of responsibility too.
You mentioned crisis there, and obviously we've also got the global pandemic happening now. How are your businesses pivoting in the midst of this?
Susanna, it has been so extraordinary to see the kind of moral imagination in crisis. You know, I'm sure people on this phone, this has been such an incredible time, and a time of loss, and a time of fear, and a time of uncertainty. And for our companies, many of them employ people that make $2-3 a day. And the companies themselves are very fragile. They're in some cases 3-4 years old. In some cases, they're very big. One of our companies in India essentially trains 100,000 construction workers and leather tanners at any given time. And so suddenly you're in a lockdown situation, and not being able to go to a job is literally a matter of feeding your children and starvation. And so we immediately pivoted in that first few days, both in the US lockdown and then a few days later in India and Pakistan and East Africa and West Africa. And we raised a series of emergency grant funding. Acumen typically doesn't make grants, so we had to pivot very quickly so that we could have a rapid deployment based on the character of our entrepreneurs, and both for-profit and nonprofit, and understand what they needed money for and what they were pivoting toward. And what was extraordinary to me is, while some were just keep payroll going as they think about the next phase, some fully transformed. And I think it is the opportunity of crisis. And so, because it accelerates things that were starting, but that we as human beings don't like change. So we resist. So there's a woman named Sarah Saeed Khurram in Pakistan, and she had developed a health tech platform, essentially recognizing, one, that 30% of women doctors stop practicing once they marry. And she didn't want that underutilized resource to go wasted. And so she wanted to connect them to people who needed healthcare in rural areas that typically don't have access and want to see a woman. Two, telemedicine would allow them to work with a local health worker that just required basic training in the village, and then they could the more educated doctors could provide consultations online. She quickly decided that she also wanted to do an app where people could speak directly to doctors online for a fee, but very few people wanted to use it. They had about 50 consultations a day, but they built their clinics to 26. The first day of lockdown in Pakistan, there was an announcement as well that private health clinics were considered non-essential because the government didn't want people gathering in rural areas. And so Sarah just pivoted. She made it free for everyone, the tech platform. It was like, this is all I have now, if you need it. And they quickly went from 50 to 1,000 consultations a day, which meant she suddenly needed more doctors. All of these Pakistani doctors volunteered. And then people started calling her from New Zealand and the United States and Canada and the UK. And so then she started partnering with government so that they would accept the registration of all these diaspora doctors. And now you're seeing a public-private partnership, technology enabled, where people are getting used to paying, or not paying yet, but having online consultations that they trust. And I don't think they're going to go back.
No.
And I have so many examples like that, that have just essentially started to create the world that we want to see. That in almost every case are partnerships of government, the civil society, and the private sector working together to solve a problem, rather than staying in their lane and having just one hand,
or being negative towards the other hand and close-minded to that,
and not trusted in right.
Yeah, and not you talk in your book about people needing to exercise their moral imagination muscle and their courage muscle, and that is, really speaks to me, because one of the Laidlaw values that we have for our scholars is about being brave. And we talk a lot about how it's easy to make the right, good, ethical choices when you're in a beautiful leafy quad. It's a lot harder when you're trying to persuade somebody who's perhaps more experienced than you, or who has some sort of power over you, etc., to do the right thing, and to be imaginative and not just go along with the status quo and so on. So I'm really interested in this concept of exercising moral imagination and courage. How do you go about doing that?
In a way, just as you said, to start small steps. When I first was thinking about a chapter on courage, because clearly if you want to be a disruptor, if you want to create new systems, you have to go against the status quo that does not want to change. And so, one, you have to be willing to change yourself, and two, you have to learn to speak truth to people that may not want to hear it. So you have to learn to speak it so they can hear it, and that's the moral imagination. And you have to say it out loud. It's not enough to always say it behind people's backs and with a sense of righteousness. And that's hard. And it's particularly hard. I grew up as a girl in a military immigrant Catholic patriarchal family. And so I was taught to be good, to respect authority, to be polite at all times. And those are really good qualities, but they don't lead to disruptive change. And so for me, it was learning slowly, try those things where I was literally sometimes shaking like a leaf, but learning to speak through trembling lips, and seeing that there was power in that, and that the next time it wasn't as scary. Same with public speaking. I used to be the worst public speaker that the world had ever seen. And it would take me all night to practice sometimes for a 5-minute speech. And I would still shake like a leaf when I would speak. But you do it enough times and you realize that you survive it. And then before you know it, you're kind of okay at it. And so for the moral imagination, there are times when I just make assumptions rather than listen from a place of inquiry. I could be too tired, I could be too certain, whatever it is. But if I can check it and learn from it, then I get better at it. And it's pretty much as simple as that. But it also means that, especially when you're young, to know that you are going to make mistakes, that you are going to fail. And the courage is in getting up and doing it again anyway, knowing that you're probably going to fail again. But that's the only way we end up building. And I think, 35 years into this work, probably one of the biggest lessons I've learned, Susanna, is that the people who ultimately make the biggest change are the people who stay in the game.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. And I think inspiring too for many of the different groups that we've got on the webinar today, because we have our scholars who are really just starting out in their, being part of the moral revolution. We also have some CEOs and chairs of really big multi-million-dollar organizations. So for those people who have been in one particular game for quite a long time and have built their business's valuation and their whole narrative around profit, how do they embrace this moral revolution as well and bring their employees, their shareholders, their boards along with them?
It's hard. So let's just start there. Just huge respect for anyone who builds anything. It's really easy to be critical and it's really hard to build.
Yeah.
My colleague Sonia actually just recently today said, in this moment where the whole world has broken open, there's a requirement for all of us to be young again. And I think this is a moment to renew who we are and who we want to be, and to think of it as a sort of rebirth. It's a lot easier to build from scorched earth in some ways, because you get to make everything up. And as an entrepreneur, the early days of building Acumen, while they were really, really hard in some cases, it's fun to be an upstart because you're building the world that you dream without having to deal with the world you inherited, which is what CEOs have. I think the good news today, and what CEOs everywhere are recognizing, is that there is a generation of employees that will not accept companies that are not serious about purpose, that are not serious about sustainability. And so you've got a powerful stakeholder group right there that is a voice to help you. There's also a powerful stakeholder group in who your consumers are. The harder stakeholder groups are your shareholders, who are used to business done in one way, and often boards. In the United States, I was recruited to be on a board because there's a statistic that if women are on boards, there is a likelihood to have more conversations about climate change. However, more than 60% of boards don't think climate change should be a topic for the boardroom.
60%?
60%.
Oh my goodness.
That's got to change.
Yeah.
And so this is a moment for courageous CEOs to start with where they are, recognize all the achievements that have been gained, and know that playing for the long term now requires a shift to more than return on investment for shareholders, that we have to create systems that work for the many. And if we don't, it may still work as a very, very short-term strategy, but it will fail as a long-term strategy. That's just clear, I think, to all of us. The only other piece of great news is that the Business Roundtable has put a very powerful statement with some of the biggest companies in the world saying, we recognize the need to move to stakeholder rather than shareholder. And in my experience, narrative does drive strategy. And so at least the narrative is shifting. Now we need examples of business models and role models, and we need to do a better job of celebrating those kinds of inclusive, sustainable business models and role models, rather than just the most profitable ones.
Yeah. And you talk about some of these things, just taking time, right? And that sometimes the dreams that you're working towards are just too big to be completed within your lifetime. And you tell that incredibly powerful and moving story of fellow Kula who tragically died sort of before her work could be completed, but that it did then go on to succeed. Will you just share with us, before we move on to the questioning part of this webinar, what are some of your dreams, and what would you like to pass on to our next generation of leaders who are with us here today?
Thanks, Susanna. Yeah, the story Susanna is referring to is really one of my co-founders of the microfinance bank, who was one of the first women parliamentarians in the country, and I really loved her. But a few months after we started this bank, and I was by then, maybe I had just turned 25, 26 years old, and she got killed in a hit and run accident, and everyone said it was connected to a policy for gender rights that she had pushed forward. This is way back in '87. And literally 30 years later, I was back in the country, and I met her niece, who now helps run the financial system, essentially. And that's when I saw that I'm back to complete work that she couldn't complete. And that it is my job to continue to take on dreams so big I can't solve them in my lifetime. For me, the single most important idea that I'm prepared to live for is human dignity. You know, a world where we see every single person as a real, full human being, and put the systems in place to enable each of us to fulfill that. It's a complicated dream, and it asks a lot of every single one of us, but it's certainly a dream that is worth living for and working on. And I actually think that when we dare to dream so big that we may not complete those dreams in our lives, we provide for ourselves a thread, a North Star that drives us toward a greater sense of understanding of what our purpose is, and ultimately brings us home to our truest selves from a place of deep meaning. And I was lucky to have mentors in their 80s and 90s who were the youngest, sparkliest people I had ever met. And they were those dreamers that just never gave up.
That is wonderful. And you say to help you achieve your dreams, writing a manifesto and committing to a manifesto really helps in that journey. Would you just tell us as the last thing before I'm going to ask you if you would to read Acumen's manifesto? What are the components that our scholars, our business leaders who have joined us here today should be including in their own moral manifesto?
Well, I think it starts with asking yourself the question that if there's not an idea for which you're prepared to die, is there an idea for which you're prepared to live? And what might that be? And I don't believe that many of us are lucky to know that early on in our lives. We kind of have to stumble along, and then purpose ultimately finds us. But not when we're just sitting there thinking about purpose. I think we get purpose by doing a lot of other things, and following good leaders, following instincts, solving problems around us. But as we get closer to an understanding of what that is, what are the values that drive you? What are the deepest values that drive you? How do you think about the means that you want to use to achieve the ends or the goals that you hope to attain? Ultimately, how do you want to be? Because that will help you make decisions that are sometimes gruelingly difficult to make. As I said before, we're at this moment in history where we know we have to reimagine our institutions, but we don't have replacements yet. Yeah. And so what we all need to build is our own moral compass, our non-negotiables, as well as the recognition of where we have to navigate tension. And that can take a huge level of humility as well, which I think we all need, myself included. And so this is an aspirational document, and we all try to live up to it at Acumen, and we don't always do that, but I'll just read it.
Please.
Because it does come up in every investment committee meeting in We hear it all the time. We use it. It starts by standing with the poor, listening to voices unheard and recognizing potential where others see despair. It demands investing as a means, not an end, daring to go where markets have failed and aid has fallen short. It makes capital work for us, not control us. It thrives on moral imagination, the humility to see the world as it is, the audacity to imagine what it could be. It's having the ambition to learn at the edge, the wisdom to admit failure, and the courage to start again. It requires patience and kindness, resilience and grit, a hard-edged hope. It's leadership that rejects complacency, breaks through bureaucracy, and challenges corruption, doing what's right, not what's easy. It's the radical idea of creating hope in a cynical world, changing the way the world tackles poverty, and building one based on dignity.
It's so beautiful and powerful. Thank you, and for sharing all of your stories and your insights. I'm now going to look and see the questions that we had from people and see what else. Oh, there's some amazing, interesting comments. I'm just going to try and find some that aren't too long. Okay, so Lauren says, what is the biggest challenge you faced and how did you overcome this? Also, how do you most effectively hold yourself and your colleagues accountable to the Acumen Manifesto?
What's the biggest challenge that I faced?
There's a long list. Huh?
I think in the beginning, probably not the very beginning, I would say there was an existential moment at Acumen. Well, I know there was an existential moment at Acumen, probably 10 years in. So about 10 years ago, when we had been heralded as this pioneer of impact investing. But then suddenly impact investing was taking off. And when we were starting, nobody paid any attention to us. Most people laughed at it and thought it was a really stupid idea that you make money in business and then you give it away as philanthropy. And so I had hundreds of very humiliating meetings. But that wasn't the most challenging because I still had the sense that, well, the way it's working isn't working, so let's try something new. But then suddenly, all these other players said, wait a minute, what I hear is I can make a lot of money and solve world hunger. And I was like, no, that is not what I'm saying. And so you started to see player after player after player come into the impact investing space and believe that there were no trade-offs, that we could solve all of the problems of education, healthcare, water, just with private sector investment. And they paid people a lot of money. It was essentially pretty much business as usual. And that was attractive, including to people even on my own team who were like, Jacqueline, you're too stubborn. We're the leader, we need to move with the field. And it's like, but that, we haven't even proven yet what this is. And so we may be following blindness. We have to stay until we know one way or another. I wasn't saying that we're right, but I knew that this new approach was claiming space without recognizing whether we were right or wrong, if we were a pioneer. And so we went through a period of losing confidence. It was hard to be the nonprofit female that would sit in room after room after room and hear everybody talk about their expected financial returns. And I'd be like, but what about the impact? And they'd be like, yeah, whatever. Any investment in Africa is an impact investment. And so I think what was so challenging, Susanna, about that period was that, losing people who I really loved and respected and still do on my team. And my own internal doubt, not sure if maybe they were right and I was playing it too stubbornly, too small. What I discovered there is that the people who stayed became not only the flag bearers, but they brought a renewed level of energy and focus on what we were doing and why we were doing it. And that was connected to our manifesto. To be an investment organization that is really trying to learn how to use capital and have the first lines of your manifesto be, it starts by standing with the poor, is a radical proposition. And it takes people who are willing to take big risks and walk in the room and not be the one that's popular.
Yeah.
And so that was the most challenging. Now it's really exciting because, you know, people are really on board and we have recognized that we need different kinds of capital to solve different kinds of problems. And my hope is that the impact space will have room for those that are doing no harm. And that is fantastic. But there will be a spectrum that also recognizes the critical importance of early stage philanthropic based focus on building systems and institutions that specifically are there to include people who have been left out of the system for too long.
Yeah, thank you. Lucia has a hand raised. Can we unmute?
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Hi, Lucia.
Thank you for your talk. It's been very insightful, very interesting. I have a question regarding Acumen. Basically, reading your website, I found out like you don't only operate in East Asia or Africa, but also in South America. And I'm personally quite interested about South America because I know that like their kind of economy is quite different from African one. So while in Africa, the main problem is basically the globalization of multinational corporations. And so that's what creates like poverty and this kind of gap. In South America, most of the time, like Western companies kind of outsource to local businesses. And so there's even like a wider gap between rich and poor. And so I was wondering if you use different strategies with Acumen or you kind of trying to follow a same track. And in line with that, as of course you're clearly adapting to different economies and different countries, if you ever thought that Acumen and what you do would be effective also in kind of weaker economies in developed countries, like for example, when Greece had the financial crisis, or even when like even with the Italian economy that's always like floating with Italy and Spain, we never have a very stable economy as might do some like the US or especially Northern Europe. So what's your overview?
Thanks, Lucia. So you're right. When we decided to work in Latin America, it was after we had been working for 10 years in India, Pakistan, East and West Africa. And we had a real conversation about the nature of poverty, and what we wanted to look at next was the poverty of inequality and not just the poverty of absolutes. And so we didn't know what to expect, but particularly in Colombia, where you've got an incredibly powerful and highly skilled elite community of business leaders, there was real opportunity. And also you had 50 years of civil war, which left part of the country without hope, without trust, without adequate skills, and again, infrastructure. And so we actually found levels of absolute poverty in the post-conflict areas of Colombia, plus a lot of violence. And so there, because of the nature of Colombia's post-conflict areas, our companies tend to be much smaller. And I would say we see much more of what we would call an accompaniment approach. By that, I mean, rather than just invest in bigger companies and help them grow a little bit at more distance, this would be the Jesuit practice of walking beside farmers, helping them learn how to build, for instance, a centralized coffee bean washing mill, which is essential to the supply chain of coffee. And it might be 3-4 years to get the Association of Farmers to a point where there's trust, there's an understanding of how rudimentary business might work. And so, and on the plus side, we have a greater chance to connect them to larger companies in the United States and Japan and other markets that can then purchase from those farmers. So it is slightly different. We do also operate in America. We have Acumen America now, and we saw a similar thing where there are pockets of absolute poverty. So we do work culturally in slightly different ways. In terms of Europe, our next move was what we call Acumen America, Acumen Academy. And so we have a fellows program that's now in 9 regions, not just in Acumen's footprint, but also in the UK, which just got started, Spain, Malaysia, and Bangladesh. And so our hope is that we start spreading this ethos, that we don't have to set up funds in every one of these countries, but that Acumen Academy, by identifying young, diverse leaders and supporting them year after year after year, those will happen naturally from local funders who want to bring this into their countries.
Yeah, thank you very much. I found very interesting how, with economics, you actually adapt to these different situations. Especially as I told you, I'm very fascinated about South America and how their economy has also been heavily influenced by various financial crises in the past 30 years. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucia.
Okay. And I think, Collins, you're here and have raised your hand. Can I find you?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Novogratz and Madam Kempe, for your insightful panel. It's been such a wonderful hour or so listening to you. My question was more so on kind of preparing ourselves to be in a position where we can step up to the plate. If you could speak somehow to maybe some of the investments you've made in your personal development that allowed you to be the kind of leader that you are today, and some ways that we can also spend this time, especially in quarantine at home, to look for ways to develop ourselves, to be able to be stronger, more confident leaders when the time comes to step up to the plate.
Collins, you can call me Jacqueline, but besides that, I've never been asked that either. So thank you for that. I actually think in this time of global interdependence, there's nothing like curiosity. And so one of the great joys in my life has been getting to know my own country and other countries around the world in a more granular way. And there's nothing like literature to help me understand. When I first read 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and he talked about women, a character named Reba who eats dirt, I didn't understand that was actually true. I thought it was this just magical rather than magical realism until I worked in Rwanda. And so when we discovered that many women in our microfinance bank were eating dirt when they were pregnant, I had real insight through this other literature from across the world. And it turned out that they were so nutrient starved that they literally craved the nutrients in dirt. So one, I would say, feed your curiosity. It may not be literature. It may be another kind of knowledge, and we have so much knowledge at our fingertips. 2 is get close to leaders you admire, either through studying them, asking them to help mentor. I had one of the world's most extraordinary mentors, a man named John Gardner, who was a part of my life for over 20 years. Not that regularly, but whenever I would reach out, there he would be. And 3, just keep daring yourself to get uncomfortable. I just came across, it's funny, Colin, an email that I'd written, a memo that I'd written in 1993 when I was on the subway And I was in a completely dysfunctional organization with people who did not want to change at all, but I clearly was trying, where I was on the subway and I saw two like 12, 13-year-old African-American boys. And I just went up and started talking to them, apparently. I don't remember this experience, but it's in my memo. Because I noticed that they were having a hard time reading. And in fact, they couldn't read their Metro card. And so then I found out what school they went to, and I followed them, not that day, but I went to that school. And I ended up creating this whole strategy for how we might improve education, which my board at the time completely rejected. But it was just this random moment where I saw two beautiful young people who did not have the skills that they should have by then. And I didn't let fear keep me from just asking them, you know, who they were and what they were. So I would say keep pushing that level of discomfort. I ended up also that year starting a greeting card company with a group of 12-year-olds in Harlem, which is a neighborhood of New York City, which at the time was more uniformly lower income. And I learned the power of teaching math and literacy to kids by having a project that we could build together. And we ended up making a lot of profits, and they were philanthropists too. So it sounds almost like Girl Scout stuff, but all of those experiences live deep inside of me.
Wonderful. Thank you
so much.
I know we are running out of time. Are you okay just to do 2 more questions, or are you supposed to be somewhere else?
I think so. Knowing me, I'm supposed to be somewhere else. I'm actually supposed to be on a call right now.
Oh. Okay, 1 question.
If Sonia's on the line, she can email Bavidra and tell him I'll be 3 minutes late, and then we'll do 1.
Gianmarco, where are you? There you are.
Hi.
Ask your question.
Hi, thank you. So in the chapter where you talk about your experience at the Rockefeller Foundation, there was this quote that really strikes me. It says, by hiding part of my identity, I had been denying myself and others what I could bring to the table. And then you also add the identity, our own and that of others, is always in the room. So I wonder whether this is all about being aware of our own identities, or is also about being committed to actually showing them. And if it's about being committed to showing them, I think about places like, you know, regions that for cultural reason or for any other reason, this might not lead to the best solutions or to the best outcomes. So I wonder, how can you reconcile your true identities and integrity with cultural differences? So
Gianmarco, you just asked me a question that could take me 2 hours, and I only have 1 minute. Let me try to shorthand that, because I'm now having 30-minute meetings from 2 minutes ago forward. One thing I worry about for this moment in history is that while we're seeing a breaking open and a recognition of Black Lives Matters, of who has been excluded, so are we also seeing a hardening on both sides, a hardening of resisting to go into that uncomfortable space. And then there's also a righteousness that I see, where people are creating a vocabulary that is the right way of speaking. Who is allowed to speak? When are you allowed to speak? And I worry that that means we actually, both sides, at the extreme edges, both sides end up shutting down parts of ourselves and parts of each other. And so I think it is to us to find ways to create those communities where people have the permission to explore one another and their own selves. That also starts with really understanding the how to listen, how to respect. I've been spending the first 3.5 hours of my day for the last now 8 days in 2 of our South Asian countries with 20 wildly diverse individuals. In one country where you could be essentially legally not just sanctioned but killed for being gay or transgender. And there are other people in the room that are gay. And it's a risk, to your point, even to say out loud in this trusted group who you really are. And yet, as trust gets built, and I'm not even mentioning the name of the country just because this is recorded, as trust gets built, there is a growing comfort that we now live in a world where there are both feudal systems and honor killings and conversations about when do humans become part robot happening at the same time. And your generation especially is going to have to learn how to navigate that in a way that doesn't exile people or cancel them out because they haven't gotten with the program, and yet helps them bring the best of who they are into the mix. And that is a really hard skill set to gain. But when you get there, and part of the reason I keep doing this, even though it means I have to get up at 4 a.m, is you get a deeper understanding of what not only the human journey is, but what the human possibility is. That if we actually could become a world where nobody is considered less than, where everybody is encouraged to bring the beautiful parts of themselves forward, as we also have the courage to jettison those parts of our traditions and selves that don't serve the world anymore. That, I think, that is the work. That is the work. But we don't get there by hiding parts of ourselves. On the other hand, we have to recognize, one, some people can't hide the parts of themselves that are threatening. And two, some people can get killed if they don't hide. And so I really appreciate the thoughtfulness in that question. And it's certainly something that with Acumen Academy, we're trying very, very hard to navigate. Because when you see it in its full flowering, there's nothing more beautiful. And there's no way this is not the world that we are supposed to be creating.
Thank you.
Jacqueline, thank you so much. Thank you for your insights, your inspiration. Thank you all for attending. I hope that you are now all fully convinced that you need to be exercising those muscles of moral imagination and courage, and join Jacqueline and everybody else who is really forging ahead with this moral revolution. So thank you all for coming. You will find this recording that Jacqueline mentioned on the Laidlaw Scholars Network. By all means, join in the conversation there, continue to talk with each other, and let's go on this beautiful journey together. Thank you all.
Thank you, and good luck to all of you. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.